Thank you for having us. Thank you for enabling us actually to have this very interesting session. So let's start. Just to give you a bit of introduction about the session. So we start now. We have welcome, and then we will see objectives from Rolf from the Commission. Then we will give a bit of the introduction about one of the EU projects called CEI Sphere. And the hourglass model that came out of there, and then, of course, what are the links with the open source and with the research. And then we start with the individual, let's say, presentations of the series of experts that you see on a screen. Some of them are also related to some of the EU projects, not in general about those projects, but how these projects can be leveraged in the sense of the operationalizing of the open source software strategy. And then we will continue with the panel discussion after the lunch, and then we end up with a Q&A with the audience. Now, on the speaker, we will not have enough time to get into details about each of the colleagues, but here is the list. So Rolf from the Commission, Ignacio Nacho from the Universidad Politécnica de Valencia and also from the OCI project, Georgios from the UBTech and also co-pilot, so two big large-scale pilot projects related to the also project called CEI Sphere. Lucian from RTE, we will also talk about links, let's say, with the Linux Foundation. Antonio, who is also part of the CEI Sphere OCI project. Giovanni, member of many other, let's say, new projects that are coming, like E3C, right? And include, just as an example. Manrique from our host Eclipse Foundation. And then myself from BluSpecs and also from a couple of already mentioned projects. So this is how it goes usually. Okay, so just to start with a very brief introduction about CEI Sphere project, which is one of the coordinating support actions financed by the European Commission. So what about the projects? So you see basically here what are the 5 kind of key, I would say, things to develop out of the project. So establish a solid ground for large-scale pilot cooperation, large-scale pilots, OCI co-pilot that you see here, and you will hear from them in the next presentation, so we will not go into that now. Develop extensive data-driven understanding of the European CEI market. That's quite important to see where are the sort of common architectures, common approaches, synergies that can be built. Support the privacy-preserving open-edge ecosystem, building a spheres. So spheres, we will explain a bit later what this is, and technology backbone toolkit that Antonio will talk about also. And then to curate also the CEI stakeholder ecosystem. Now on the main activities, definitely is the spheres, like the name of the project calls, which is basically to map use cases from the 2 already mentioned big large-scale pilot projects into the spheres. We have 3 spheres. We will show you on the next slide which one are there. And then to identify the key challenges for these spheres, and then basically how this can be deployed in the market and what is the market, I would say, reaction to this. Building the use case catalog, and then to see also can we make some sort of the alignment, let's say, with Eurostack. Antonio will talk about this later. Open calls, which are run by the 2 big LSPs, and then what are also the synergies that can come out of it, and then organize hackathons. We will basically co-organize 1 hackathon with OCI, Copilot, and Eclipse Foundation end of June in Cagliari, and then hopefully we will also be able to provide inputs to the Eclipse SDV hackathon in October. On the spheres, you see here there are 3 that we identified through basically assessing the use cases of the 2 large-scale pilot projects. Energy and infrastructure resilience, you see 17 use cases as a primary, 11 as a secondary. What I mean by this is that, of course, in a lot of use cases, you have a sort of overlap or, let's say, joint domains in each of them. So, for example, if you talk about vehicle to grid, obviously that's about mobility, but since you have grid, obviously this is about energy as well, right? Then mobility, logistic, and a software-defined vehicle, and then industrial optimization and productivity. And you can see that this is almost equal distribution of use cases. That's not by purpose, that simply came out like that. But I think it's quite nice that it's in a way balanced, not that like one area has, I don't know, 30 and the other area has 5. So this also shows actually where the interest goes. And at the end, ultimately, and hopefully, these spheres should show also a sort of the test with the market, a sort of the market validation, how this actually sits and feels with the market, because both projects should be innovation actions, which means very close to the market. So these are not theoretical research lab activities. These are actually activities that are very close to the market, and hopefully we can help to see actually what could be the possible market uptake of these use cases. We also have 3 task forces that are supporting actually the spheres and the whole work together. Task Force 1, which is about the open source architecture standardization, led by Antonio. Task Force 2, which is the market uptake industry engagement, that will take a bit, we'll talk a bit later about that. So go-to-market pathways, tech briefs, open call spurts. And then Task Force 3, which is a stakeholder forum outreach. Of course, there is a link to other technology platforms, other initiatives. This is not like isolated case working around its own, let's say, X, but this is a part of the larger ecosystem, and we want to actually get engaged with them and also see how this works together with them. And then we try to see also how we could align with initiatives like the Eurostack. So we try to do what we call the hourglass model, which Antonio will explain exactly after this slide. And we try to see also then how, so every use case from both projects is mapped against the hourglass, and then we try to see, okay, what could be the possible links to the Eurostack initiative. This is just one example from the co-pilot one industry cluster mapping, and Antonio will give us a bit more details. But why this is important? Because this is a sort of the leeway where we also start to talk about open source components as well, right? So that was for the introduction. Thank you for your attention. And then I think we can continue with slides from Antonio. I think it should be...
Rolf first.
Oh, yes, you're right.
So first of all, let's switch to Rolf, and then
Yes,
we will come back.
you're right. Rolf, please. give us. Okay, so it should be this one, right? So you can come here.
All right, thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. Very good to be here. I'm in the unit called now Intelligent Mobility, Energy and IoT. Our main stakes are in software-defined vehicles on the one hand, but also in the transition of the energy systems and looking at what we call on the research. And it was mentioned on research, we spend more than 300 and now the new project more than 500 million on what we call cloud-edge-IoT continuum. So it's continuum in the area of, you mentioned the energy sphere, you mentioned the mobility sphere, but also now the telco cloud edge. It's continuum there, but as said, research has also double sword. It also has this angle of policy support. And policy support means, on the one hand, yes, I think we talk about key elements like the sovereign package. I think Thibaut talked about that yesterday. But also they supported the conference on the policies on smart bidirectional charging last November to be visible. And you also heard now in the panel just before on the CRA, which is a burning issue for many of the companies developing what we call software-defined open source programmable infrastructure. So I think our main stake in the unit is to look at the industrial software stack for future infrastructures. Yes, and to give you one example, and I think what drives us at the moment, what Commission policies, is artificial intelligence. I think it's all over. And one example is the energy system is one of the most complex systems ever built, one of the most largest systems, distributed systems. And it also has to go under a transition towards decentralized systems and more software-based systems. So here we have a real challenge over there to see what's happening if we introduce intelligence and automation, how to oversee the whole system. But the advantage of AI is it can deal with complexity and increasingly uncertainty about the user behavior. Charging stations, heating, whatever it's got, electrification. It's very, very difficult. So not surprising that the Commission has started a lot of legislation on AI, and just to recap a bit, last year it was the AI continent to build AI capacity at scale. More than 200 billion euro will be mobilized for building AI factories and gigafactories. The infrastructure for AI, I think the main infrastructure to develop large models, to compute and data and tools provide access to high quality data. Second important legislation is once you have the infrastructure, you also have to make sure that you create benefits for industry and users. So it's the Apply strategy also launched last year, moving towards AI from pilots to deployment, increase productivity in key sectors, and support SMEs and startups gaining access to the infrastructure and the AI data labs in order to really use and promote AI models. What's coming this year, and that was mentioned yesterday by my director Thibault, it's the European Sovereign Package with 3 elements: the Cloud AI Development Act, to scale up European data centers by a factor of 3 to triple the capacity, ensure sustainability and security in AI deployment. Second one is, and that back to energy, preparing a sovereign strategy for AI roadmap for energy. It's also coming up. Accelerate AI innovation, moving the large models for energy systems as well as small models to support, in particular, smart and intelligent demand supply flexibility. And that's one of the key issues of decentralization. And the third element is, you heard it yesterday, open digital ecosystems to support open source for technology sovereignty. And that's one of the key elements of my talk. And to have an approach on that one, particularly for industry, you need a structured approach. You mentioned the Eurostack already. No, in order to ensure sovereignty, we have to cover the whole stack. The whole stack from the components of microprocessors, the embedded software, the edge computing, the networks and connectivity towards the cloud, the applications, and the application layer. A software stack, to make it happen, you need modular building blocks in order to reuse what has been developed by others to have efficiency. And you have to connect systems, and that's the IoT part. And there, the complexity is increasing because you have to define the interactions and the interfaces of the different systems. And in terms of security, as you need some sort of governance models across different systems. Here, you mentioned the hourglass model, and then that has a role play to gain over there. And last but not least, for software-driven systems, you also have to make sure that you have the basic hardware for that, and that we have a lot of projects supported under the CHIPS Act and CHIPS JU. So what are the benefits we expect from open source? First of all, it's harnessing the power of innovation, because we see innovation now with an unprecedented speed. So legacy systems have difficulties to cope up with that. And we have the advantage of the open source decentralized communities, the creators, the innovators, to move fast, adopt technology, identify risk as well, and show implementations. So there we have a lot of things where we can benefit from these communities. Secondly is interoperability of standards. We have recently seen that if you provide the code for an emerging standard, you can really show it works or doesn't work. So it's much faster than formal standardization. And more important, for the interaction of systems to test interoperability of standards. And that's, it's an added value for small companies and companies to use the standards, because if you only have one standard in an isolation, it has no value. If you test the interoperability and shows that it works through the whole stack, it has an advantage. Thirdly, efficiently through reuse of building components, and there it's a bit of a plea for the foundations to show, the interoperability, and that you don't have different isolated projects, that you have a whole stack of projects which also are collaborating. Fourthly, sustainability, extended of product cycles, all that, if you deploy hardware and then the change of regulation or the innovation, if you cannot use it anymore, I think open source has potential, can you still extend the life cycle of hardware. That applies for PCs, putting Linux on that, all that is more efficient, but it also applies to charge stations, in order to make sure they still are secure. So US is demanding open source for charge stations to avoid any backdoor in the system. And last but not least, collaboration. has the advantage of skills and training for your people. We have a parallel stream on software-defined vehicle, and I mention it because it's supported by the Commission by ECAVA, the European Connected and Automated Vehicle Alliance, looking at a whole software stack, the open source software stack for software-defined vehicles across the software integration in the car, from embedded systems to the infotainment and telemetry, the user experience, as well as the hardware. That's a major adventure endeavor of the Commission at the moment, but we have a whole stack. It's the SDV stack, which is supported under Eclipse. So that's a key example, where we have a project for full software stack led by industry. And that is maybe also an example for other industry, to have software-defined autonomous systems built on open standards and architectures. We have an open source stack so everybody can test it, and that the different building blocks work together. And finally, it's also a leverage to integrate AI at the systems. I think without a software integration, you cannot do any AI. So that's a key element. And then, it's built on sovereign computing and chips. So we think that could be a role model as a sovereign software stack also for other industry, and that's a bit of discussion. We have Eclipse, but also maybe a role model for other foundations like Linux. It's part of the Sovereign Package 2026, and we're looking, also applying that to other industry like software-defined automation, software-defined drones, or software-defined defense is the discussion at the moment, or software-defined charging as a stack for charging. So, and then back to energy again, what's happening there, just to visualize a bit, what is happening there. If you install a wall box, in the past, it was a point-to-point connection. You get agreement by the energy system operator. This centralized operation is one of the past because, systems are saturated. You don't get this connection agreement anymore unless you have a decentralized orchestration of the different charging and energy consumption. So you need load balancing between charging stations. You have to connect to residential batteries. You have to liaise in with other big consumers like heat pumps. And most important, the simple thing is, that you link the charging to the solar, which requires, again, interoperability of standards. I think there's a connection, also to the standard of the solar inverter. And to be practical again, we have an open source project working with Linux Everest, on a software stack for charging, which implement the ISO 15118-20, but also looks at the interoperability with the IEEE 2030.5 or the SunSpec Modbus in order to link charging to solar, the most easiest case. And that they demonstrate the interoperability of standards, they give seminars, and they really show, where the protocol is not ready, where you can do the mapping of standards. And it's a great work, of getting the community together and look also, not just coding, but also providing the code for the standard in order to facilitate the adoption of the standard and to have a print-ready solution, deployment-ready solution. So it's a reference hardware testing and a reference implementation, what you have over there. And then you have a community, you has easy access to either tailor-made solutions or, to do a mapping to commercial solutions. And we get a lot of recognition over here, also from partly commercial associations, because also they want to see, how to link to these standards. And if you have already a demonstration, it works a lot. And we will have another conference in November about the EV Leaders Conference, V2G Leaders Conference, in order to again, bring that to stage. And that basically is my last slide on the key takeaways, what is our current concerns. Yes, I think we want to support the industrial transition towards agile programming interfaces. The software is everywhere. But that's the baseline, for AI-based autonomous systems. For that, we promote open architectures across, cloud edge infrastructures and down to the chip level. The Eclipse SDV is a role model for really industrial engagement and showing, to create an open source industrial stack. And as mentioned, open source is accelerating the standards adoption and interoperability of standards. They give visibility to a lot of communities and industry and advice. And as we heard in the previous session, there are challenges remaining about the governance across different projects about security, trust and security, a trusted framework, who controls the trusted framework. We heard the issues of the manufacturer, and maybe we have some discussion after my talk now. Thank you so much for your attention.
We didn't do it on purpose, but the last line is hourglass model, and I'm going to talk about that, okay? Because Rolf was supposed to start first, but we made a mistake. Yeah, so the hourglass model, we came up with the idea during the kickoff of CEI Sphere. It's a colleague from Damir who did this, and he showed this. And we thought, yeah, it's a good tool to discuss together, okay? I mean, not only technical people, but the demand side and the supply side, okay? And realize that actually it has been used quite a while, okay? And there are many, if you Google hourglass model, you will see many. Now you'll see ours, okay? But you can see that it was actually even a model here. There's a mathematical formalization, and they show that this was the reason of the success of the internet, using IP and also Unix, okay? So the idea is we can do it to create an ecosystem which is synchronized. So where we have, we bridge the gap between the demand and the supply side. So here we have the managers, here we have technical guys, okay? But it has to work. So the consistency is ensured by the fact that you have standards. So that's what Rolf mentioned. And also open source, so available solutions. Because if you create an ecosystem that is actually private, you are not sure. You could succeed, but you are not sure you will succeed. So getting open source is a better guarantee to reach people, okay? So, and I'm repeating some of the items which Rolf has mentioned about reusability and, of course, getting this consistency, okay? So, examples. So we get into, for instance, standards, and here you can see that if you look at this with this hourglass model, where here you have infrastructure, okay, so Meta OS, embedded AI, energy OS, on top data analytics, use AI and things like that. So you can come up with standards that are useful. And we're not reinventing the wheel. We are reusing things that have been created by other people, for instance, minimum interoperable mechanisms that come from smart city, we can reuse it, okay? And below, we have architecture one reuse, so architecture patterns is the thing we reuse, okay? And then we have what we are doing in this project, CEI, cloud-edge-IoT assets. So we want to have reusable assets that we can use, okay? And on top of it, then you can have AI, reasoning and things like that. And we need semantic models. We need interoperability. So all those things, we will address them, and other things, because here I didn't mention cybersecurity. Obviously, cybersecurity is transversal. So the fact is, actually, in reality, you have multiple ecosystems. If you try to put everything in one ecosystem, which we'll have to do, it's hard for the manager to understand. So you need to have pictures where you focus on certain things, for instance, IoT, cloud-edge-IoT, data space, and the trust framework, okay? And we put here on purpose Copilot. Sorry, I didn't check with George, but this is an example where actually the cloud-edge-IoT could leverage the things that Copilot is doing. But of course, obviously, ideally, we have to work together. So we compete in the sense that we provide different technologies, and this is the purpose of research. But at the end of the day, when you come to the market, we should get together, okay? So, and we should have the same messages to the business stakeholders, because at the end of the day, they make the decision. So we need to work with them, okay? That's super important. And one thing that is also very important is if we keep this hourglass model present, the business people, the stakeholders, they understand what is at stake and what are the issues that we want to solve. And it's also a reminder to the people working on research and technology that they have to care about the demand, okay? Because if you don't do that, then sometimes you do something and maybe you're out of the reality, okay? So, and you lose the message that you want to have in common to create the things. So, because we do research, we create a vision, and the vision, I would say, it's a kind of technology push. Okay, you have to have this visible, explained, and understood by the business stakeholders. But then you have to mature, and some of us, including the big companies, they will go into a market push. Okay, so for instance, in France, we had the market push about the smart meter, okay? Because we had a first project in the year 2007 where we had like 80,000 meters, okay? So this is again my market push, and then there was a decision, and the decision is there, and then now it's deployed all over France, the smart meter, okay? So we need to go from technology push, and market pull. And open source, you can have here, here, and here. So the open source is maturing at the same speed, okay? So this is where we have success, okay? So that's why I have to be careful, and I need the help from Eclipse Foundation and other foundations on that. So you first have the open source development maturity, okay? So do we do a good open source? But it could be a good open source that is only done on research, okay? But then you have to check which innovation stage you are, research or industry, and you have to get from the research to the industry, exactly according to this line, okay? And last but not least, you need to have community growth, okay? So because the community has to grow, and it's a token, it's an evidence that something is happening, okay? So if we are not able to make this community grow, maybe we have an issue. Maybe not, but we have to check, okay? And this is the reason why we came up with a toolkit which we call the Backbone Toolkit. Sorry for the term. It's Backbone Toolkit for an open edge ecosystem. The document is freely available for everyone, and everyone can apply it. We are trying to apply it to learn about how we can have this hourglass model as a communication scheme between the developers and the demand side. Okay? So who uses this toolkit? All of us. EU Research Project Coordinator, that's not a joke, it's really true. Then policymakers, business stakeholders, project architects, product builders, and things like that. People, okay, that's very important, okay? And why use it? Strategic positioning, understanding how we fit and how we can integrate smoothly, for instance, in the Eurostack vision, okay? That's quite important, okay? So, and of course, you do this because you can amplify the market take-up, because you are able to explain, okay? So the manager can explain, he used the hourglass model. The technical guy, engineer, can also show it, okay? So things like that. And of course, the idea is optimize the resource. That's why we have this narrow waist, because this is where we focus on the thing we want to reuse and the projects wants to leverage, okay? That's it, that's the goal, okay? So we came up with 4 steps in order to do this, because we cannot get the best hourglass model to start, even though when you start a European project, people have in mind this, okay? So we have 2 lightweight phases where we are going to describe those hourglass models, okay? So the first is identify the ecosystem, so stakeholders with common business objectives, okay? And this, we know it from the start, otherwise the project would have been accepted, because you explain how you fit into the market, okay? So, but it's lightweight because it's already there, okay? So we just need to have it and show it as the objective, okay? Then we go more in detail. We identify the different ecosystems. You saw that we have several use cases, several proof of concepts. In OCI Copilot, probably there are several ecosystems. So we need them to work, to identify them, and then we see what's going on, okay? And then projects is developing, and we have the part 3, which is actually CI ecosystem analysis. And once we have done the implementation and before we deploy and things like that, we have a much better idea of what it is, okay? And last phase, which will be when we are mature about what we have implemented, we have what we currently call it trust label analysis, but I could maybe just call it trust analysis, because the label is the result of a certification. But in reality, we want to do a trust analysis and want to identify what are the features that we need to have, or we believe what we need to have to make it happen, okay? And this is the kind of message we'll agree actually, we'll not tell, we'll agree with the business stakeholders. If we say A, B, and C, maybe the market is growing, okay? And this has to be a common consensus between the business stakeholder, the demand side, and the supply side, okay? And of course, supported by standards and open source. I think I'm done, okay? On time, yeah, perfect. So we get to the next. Okay.